Okay, so in this module, we're going to talk briefly about VLANs and Dot1Q trunking and establishing basic connectivity, layer 2 connectivity for our devices such as our phones and our PC or Mac Jabber clients. So taking a look at basics for VLANs, we're going to, of course, create and assign our VLANs to the various switch ports. We will determine whether the ports are going to be in access or trunking mode, and this will be both for the phones as well as for trunking over to routers or other switches, of course. We'll take a look at our auxiliary or voice VLAN. So basically, if we're turning a port into an access port, but we also need to let a port know about the voice VLAN via CDP so that it can instruct the IP phone to begin marking or tagging their VLANs with a Dot1Q header with the proper VLAN ID, which even though the port is in an access mode, the switch will still allow basically any VLAN ID that matches the auxiliary, or as we'll call it, the voice VLAN that's configured on that switch port. So it's sort of a pseudo trunk. Possibly an allowed VLANs list. So if we're going to be very specific, if we have a definitive switch port mode trunk, which VLANs are allowed on that particular trunk port for added security. So just looking at, in general, 802.1q trunking, and particularly either over to another switch in a proper environment, in a larger than lab environment. Of course, we would have multiple switches. This would be a norm in any given environment, or in our smaller lab environment over to what we're going to use as a router on a stick. So let's take a look at our switch, and before we do that, let's actually just basically take a look at a basic topology. Now, the topology and the tasks that you see coming up may differ and probably will differ from this, but this is just our master topology that we'll use as overall reference. So we're going to be assigning VLANs for our phones, and we can see VLAN nomenclature here, and of course you'll have that in whatever tasks you're assigned as well. And then also we're going to be assigning for our Jabber clients that we see on various, these are all a part of switch 1, as well as our PC and, our phone and phone/PC or access VLAN that we'll be using for our Jabber clients, hanging off of our Ethernet switch modules, which are directly connected or embedded within the routers. Same thing over here on R4. We're going to have, we don't have a PC client hanging off of this, but we do have IP phones, and we'll go ahead and act like there are with the access VLAN or the PC VLAN embedded in the Ethernet switch module. So let's go ahead on switch 1, and we'll go into config T mode, global config mode, and we'll begin creating the VLANs that we need. So let's say VLAN 50, and we'll give it the name DC servers. Now, one thing to note about a VLAN, and this is probably not going to be something that will cause you too much trouble because you'll almost always exit out of VLAN or go into maybe the next VLAN or something of that nature. But if you do happen to, let's say, be on just creating a long list of VLANs and you're on your last VLAN and you haven't typed exit or hit Control-C or Control-Z or gone on to another command, that VLAN has not yet been created. So if I were to do a show VLAN brief right now, we wouldn't see VLAN 50 unless I had previously created it. But just by saying this, we won't see it until I actually type exit. And then we'll see that VLAN created. So again, not something that should cause you too much trouble, but every once in a while can hang you up if you're on your last VLAN creation. So we'll go ahead and create VLAN 60 and say name is Site A servers. Let's do VLAN 70 and say the name is Site B servers. VLAN 610 with our name Site A Jabber for our PC clients. VLAN 611 for our Site A phones, VLAN 710 for our Site B jabber, VLAN 711 for our Site B phones, and we'll go ahead and take a look. Show VLAN brief, and we should see these VLANs have been created now. Now we'll go ahead and apply these VLANs to their various ports, and you would see this on the, if you take a look, it doesn't really show it on that logical topology, but if you were to take a look at the physical topology, where the devices are physically attached on switch 1, it does show it for R3 and 4, but for the Site A and Site B that are all hanging off of switch 1, it doesn't show that, so you'd need to take a look at the physical topology. Okay, so interface fast01 is going to be access mode, and we can abbreviate these commands, and of course you'll see me do that throughout the modules, but we can abbreviate these commands, and it's definitely a good idea to get in the practice of using the shortest amount or least amount of characters whenever possible. So switch port mode access, which it probably is by default, and switch port access VLAN 50. Port 2, also going to be switch port mode access, and switch port access VLAN 60. 3, access and 70. Now we'll do interface range, FA0 4 through 6, and this will be our switch port mode access. Okay, now these are going to be our pseudo ports or pseudo trunking ports that are switch port mode access, but we're going to have a voice VLAN on there. So essentially, whether a PC plugged in directly or a Mac or any node, any laptop or desktop plugged in directly, they would get the access VLAN. If a phone plugs in, of course, they're going to get the auxiliary, the voice VLAN. They're going to be told that information through CDP, which we'll talk more about later, and they would begin tagging all of the packets that come from the internal phone switch port via that VLAN ID or with that voice VLAN ID. But the PC that's attached to the phone would still, or directly to the switch, would still pass direct traffic with no .1Q header. So we'll do our switch port access VLAN is going to be 610, and we'll say our switch port voice VLAN is going to be 611, and then we'll say for the next few ports 7 through 9. We'll say switch port access VLAN is 710, and switch port voice VLAN will be 711. Now again, your ports may vary depending on the exercise you're given and the topology. Those may vary. Take a look at your physical or logical diagrams for information on that. Okay, so now we're going to take a look or configure interface range FA011 through 12. And we're going to make this a switch port mode trunk. So these are going to be going over to either R1 or R1 and R2, depending on what your topology has set up in it. And we're going to do router on a stick. So we're going to route all of our VLANs based on the, or using R1 and R2. And this gives us a number of benefits in this particular lab, giving us the ability to separate out traffic on our routers, which have a lot more capabilities. Obviously, the performance isn't going to quite be there, but this being a lab environment, it won't cause any problems. If this were a production environment, of course, we would have those routed on a larger switch, either a Cat 6800 or a Nexus 7K or something of that nature. So it's going to be switch port mode trunk, and we're going to say switch port trunk allowed VLANs are going to be 50, 60, 70, 610, 611, 710, and 711. Now that's pretty much all the VLANs that we have defined already on the switch. So we could have just left this off, but it's a good idea to get in the habit of adding this even when you're trunking all of the VLANs that you happen to have, because you never know when more VLANs might be added, and it's not always desired to have all those VLANs traverse all links. Okay, so if we show VLAN brief again, we should see all of these assigned, and we can take a look at, even though we'll get into spanning tree later, we can take a look at spanning tree, which should be running by default for, let's say, a given VLAN, let's say VLAN 50, just to make sure that in fact it is passing traffic and in a forwarding state on FA01 and then also FA011 and 12. And we can see that the status is forwarding for all of these. So everything looks good and we've got traffic flowing on those ports. So now we can hop over to R3 and we will again go into global config and begin setting up VLANs per the diagram we've been given. So let's say VLAN 810 and the name of site C Jabber. VLAN 11, site C phones. And that should do it there. And then we'll go ahead and set some of that. So we'll say interface gig 02. Actually, we're going to go ahead and do a range here. So interface range gig 02 /2 through 3 is going to be switch port mode access. Switch port access VLAN will be 810. And switch port voice VLAN will be 811. And we can see that configured. We should see that traffic is currently in a learning state, but will go in a forwarding state very soon for these. There we go. Now in a forwarding state for these particular ports. And it looks a little bit different on the embedded switch, we can see. Jump over to R4 and do much the same thing. Create VLANs 910, name site D Jabber. 911, oops, let me go back to 910. Site D Jabber. VLAN 911. Site D phones, and VLAN 912, which we'll use later for our cluster 2 phones, Site D phones 2. Interface range, gig 0 to 1 through 2. Switch port mode access, switch port access VLAN 910, and switch port voice VLAN 911. And then we'll say port 3, which even though we're saying range, it will still take the command, is also switch port mode access, switch port access VLAN. We're actually not going to use the access VLAN. Could be 910, but we're really actually not going to use that. So I'm just going to do switch port voice VLAN 912. And we should be good there. So it'll just take the default switch port access VLAN of 1 will be the default. Save our config. Actually, there is one more thing that we need to do, and that is to go ahead and make sure that everything's set up on router 1 and router 2 as well. So what we will need to do is switch back over to router 1. And again, the task that you'll be working on may not have a router 2 in your particular tasks, but for what we're doing, we'll go ahead and just take a look and see. We will have, based on our diagram, just clear this off, we'll have all of these VLANs, at least for switch 1, coming into into router 1 and 2, and they're both connected to switch 1, as we saw already on ports 11 and 12. But we'll have these VLANs coming in, so we're going to need to go ahead and set up some sub-interfaces. So the way we'll do this is with our sub-interfaces, gig 0/0.50.60.70.610, 710, 611, and 711, and IP addressing to go with that. So I actually already have this set up, so we'll just go ahead and take a look. Do show run interface gig 00. We can see that there's no IP address, but if we were to take a look at .50, we can see that we have encapsulation .1Q for VLAN ID 50, and then we also have, of course, our IP address and some various other configuration that we'll take a look at later. So we've got that for 50, same thing for 60. We just need to tell the router what VLAN ID is going to be tagged, both what it should be expecting for traffic coming into the router, and then, so if it has a VLAN ID of 60, then send it on to this logical sub-interface, which would map the layer 2 to the layer 3. So that's what we're doing here, is a layer 3 to layer 2 mapping. And then if traffic is leaving the router, we need to know what VLAN to tag it with, so that the device on the other side, a switch in this case, knows what to do with it, what VLAN to put it in. So same thing with 70, and so on. 610, and if we just do show IP interface brief, let's pipe to exclude unassigned, then we can see all of our sub-interfaces that we have along with so our .1Q VLAN sub-interfaces along with their IP addresses. And the same things over on R2, show IP interface brief, pipe to exclude unassigned. Unassigned just says don't show me anything where the IP address uses in that column the word unassigned. So it makes it a lot easier to see only interfaces that have layer 3 IP addresses on them. Okay, so we've got all of our layer 2 to layer 3 mapping. Now it should be noted here, and you probably already know this, but just in case you don't, the actual sub-interface ID does not have to match the VLAN. So if I take a look, show run interface gig 00.50, .50 happens to match VLAN ID 50, but this is in no way, you don't have to do this. It's no way required. However, it does make everything very nice so that we always can see, you know what, since we're only going to have one VLAN per interface, or per sub-interface, then why not go ahead and put the sub-interface ID the same as the actual VLAN ID. So it's a good practice, but it's not necessary. Now there's obviously not much going on with these VLANs. As soon as we get into a few tasks later when we're doing DHCP or other things, we'll actually begin to see traffic flowing. But Spanning Tree does show us that traffic is flowing for now. There's just not much going on with them yet.